Then finally, the subcutaneous fat. So when people go on diet sweeteners, what are they doing? Are they really reducing the fat? And the answer is no.
When you're talking about artificial sweeteners.
Artificial diet sweeteners of any sort. You can pick your artificial sweetener. So aspartame or
sucralose,
stevia, monk fruit, the new ones,
Yeah, the one that people are more excited about nowadays is allulose.
Allulose,
It's
yeah.
expensive. It tends to have less of an artificial sweetener taste that people can detect.
Right.
So you're saying that regardless of – and we should I'm remembering from the comments section, I do read them, artificial sweeteners and non-caloric sweeteners.
Yes.
Because the moment you say artificial, people say, what about stevia? What about allulose? Right. So let's just say non-caloric sweeteners can wrap our arms around that entire category,
Sure.
unless we need to distinguish among the different participants in that category. So you're saying that even though people can lower their total caloric intake pretty effectively, I've seen the studies that show if dieters who consume water only as their main liquid versus diet sodas with aspartame typically or stevia, the diet soda drinkers actually lose more weight. We know that, but you're saying there may be deposition of fat in the liver in those individuals, specifically because of the artificial sweetener.
Because of the insulin. Turns out there's still an insulin response. So very famous study done in Copenhagen, 100 normal individuals, 25 in 4 different groups. One group, 1 liter of sugared soda per day for 6 months.
1 liter, that's a lot of sugared soda.
Yeah. One group, 1 liter of diet soda per day for 6 months.
I probably did that in graduate school.
One group, 1 liter of milk per day for 6 months.
I probably did that when I was an infant.
And finally, one final group, 1 liter of water per day for 6 months.
I do that now. I do more than that, but yeah.
The 1 liter of soda per day in 6 months gained 10 kilos.
The sugary soda.
The sugary soda.
10 kilos. Okay.
10 kilos. No surprise. The 1 liter of water per day lost 2 kilos. Also no surprise. Those were the easy ones. Now let's do the ones in the middle. 1 liter of milk per day, no change.
Presumably that was full-fat milk. We're talking about
full fat
Europe.
milk. Full fat milk.
Yeah, they like their full-fat milk.
No change. Why is that? They're taking on an enormous increase in total caloric intake.
I'm guessing that there was a blunted insulin response due to the fat in the milk?
And also because lactose is not a very big driver of insulin response. And because there's a satiety effect.
That's like
So
food.
they eat less.
Yeah, it's like food.
Like food. And finally, the kicker to the whole thing, diet soda. The 1 liter of diet soda. What would you predict their weight would do?
More weight loss than in the water group based on my understanding of the literature.
They gained 2 kilos.
Wild. Because they ate more.
Well, you tell me. Why did they gain 2 kilos if they were consuming a liter of diet soda, which are 0 calories? The answer is because they still generated an insulin response.
And that insulin response generated more hunger?
More weight and more hunger. Exactly. And that's the key. So they didn't gain the 10 kilos. They gained 2 kilos. So it looks better compared to the sugared version, but it looks like, a problem compared to the water version or even the milk version.
So unless you bootstrap calories and hold that constant, you're going to see a weight gain due to artificial sweetener intake.
Exactly right. And that's been shown 50 ways from Sunday in a whole bunch of different studies. So compared to sugar, yeah, it's better. But compared to water, it's way worse. And the reason is the insulin response. You put something sweet on the tongue, message goes tongue to brain, sugar's coming. Message goes brain to pancreas through the vagus nerve. Sugar's coming, release the insulin. And so tongue doesn't know if it's sugar or not. It releases the pancreas releases the insulin, which drives energy into fat, whether it was, from the diet sweetener or not.
I saw some really interesting data from Dana Small's group at Yale
Yep.
showing that when people have a diet soda with food, so this is like the Diet Coke with the sandwich or with the burger, maybe even with the pasta, the insulin response from the food and the insulin response from the diet soda are compounded, but there's a classical conditioning effect, Pavlovian effect, such that then later, if they just drink the diet soda, they get an even bigger insulin response just to the diet soda than they would have originally if they only had the diet soda separate from food. So in other words, the food-induced insulin response is conditioning a greater insulin response from the diet soda.
And we actually have another study that demonstrates the same thing out of Singapore, Tay et al. In American Journal of Clinical Nutrition 2018, I believe, that looked at a similar paradigm. Here's what they did. They took a bunch of people and they admitted them to their clinical research center 4 times a week apart, and they did them in random order. And each time they started the morning fasting, and they did either a sucrose tolerance test or an aspartame tolerance test or a sucralose tolerance test or a monk fruit tolerance test. So 2 hours, ingesting one of the 4 and measuring glucose and insulin over the course of the next 2 hours.
Fasted.
Okay. Then it was time for lunch. And they let them have whatever lunch they want. It was a metabolic buffet. They could eat whatever they wanted off the buffet, except that they were being clocked. And the same for dinner. They were being clocked, but they could eat whatever they wanted.
In a given period of time.
In the 24 hours.
Okay.
And, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., whenever they went home. Okay? Turned out the sucrose tolerance test generated an insulin response, as you'd expect. The monk fruit, the sucralose, and the aspartame did not. But then when they ate lunch, if they had had one of the 3 diet sweeteners in the morning, they ate more at lunch and more at dinner and generated an increased insulin response both at lunch and dinner, so that the area under the curve for the whole day was exactly the same.
So they ate significantly more.
Yeah, because they had the diet soda in the morning.
Wild. Well, I drink drinks that contain stevia, and I don't worry about it too much. But what you're saying is, even if I bootstrap my calories, there's a possibility that the insulin response could have direct effects on the liver.
Exactly right.
And not for the better.
Now, having said that, we have undertaken an interesting project, which I don't know if you know about. In 2020, during the pandemic, I was approached by a food company in the Middle East called Kuwaiti Danish Dairy Company, KDD. It's the Nestle of the Middle East. Now, they make all sorts of junk. Frozen yogurt, flavored milks, ice cream, confectionery, biscuits, tomato sauce, okay? Kuwait has an 18% diabetes rate and an 80% obesity rate.
8-0.
8-0.
Wow.
In the adults. All right? Now, the company recognized that they wanted to be a metabolically healthy company, and they knew they weren't. They contacted me and said, would you put together a scientific advisory team to advise us what we need to do to change the food in order to be a metabolically healthy company, and we want to lead. And I said, I'd be happy to do that with one proviso. We get to publish what we did so that it can serve as a roadmap for the rest of the food industry. And they said, fine. And so I convened a scientific advisory team with my colleague Wolfram Alderson, who started the very first farmers market in Los Angeles and is now actually the director of sustainability and nutrition for KDD. Tim Harlan, who is the head of culinary medicine at George Washington University. Rachel Gao, who is a fatty acid expert who ran the omega-3 for ADD trial at the NIH, and Andreas Kornstadt, who's actually a computer scientist from Stanford. And we basically stripped down every single thing that KDD did in terms of procurement, in terms of ingredients, in terms of packaging. We submitted every single ingredient to biochemical analysis because you couldn't trust what the vendors were basically telling KDD was in the food. We had to actually know what was in the food, and that was $500,000 all by itself. I mean, this was not a cheap little, sojourn into the woods. This was a big deal. We basically re-engineered their entire 180-item portfolio, and they have now turned over 10% of their products to be metabolically healthy. And the precepts that we set in this paper, which is in Frontiers in Nutrition in March of this year, 2023, three things, three principles. If you adhere to these three principles, you can turn any food healthy, including ultra-processed food. Number one, protect the liver. Number two, feed the gut. Number three, support the brain. If you have a food that does all three of those, it is healthy. If you have a food that does none of those three, then it's poison because it's not food.
I was going to say, it doesn't sound like food is the right descriptor in that case.
Exactly. And if it does one or two but not all three, then it's going to be somewhere in between. So the goal was to take all of KDD's products and move them from the lowest tier up to the highest tier by adhering to these three principles. And we came up with some very simple things. Number one, got to get rid of the sugar. Number two, got to add fiber. Number three, got to add omega-3s. Number four, got to do something about the emulsifiers, because the emulsifiers are causing the gut inflammation, because after all, emulsifiers are detergents. They hold fat and water together. They burn a hole in the mucin layer. So they're actually contributing to that gut inflammation. And emulsifiers are, strewn throughout ultra-processed fooddom.
We've heard about hidden sugars a lot during today's episode and elsewhere, but based on everything you told us about low-calorie sweeteners,
yep.
It makes more sense to me now why foods that are not touted as diet foods would be laced with things like sucralose, because it should drive the craving for that food through increases in insulin and craving of other foods later that day and later that evening. Is that why non-caloric sweeteners are added to all sorts of foods now? Because typically one thinks non-caloric sweeteners probably only added to quote-unquote diet foods, low-calorie foods, but that's not their only
You're right.
use.
That's not the case, and they are adding diet sweeteners to foods that you didn't know had diet sweeteners in them. That's right. There are two reasons that this happens. One is insulin, because insulin blocks leptin signaling at the level of the hypothalamus and the nucleus accumbens. So if it blocks leptin is the hormone that your fat cells make that tells your brain you've had enough. So if insulin blocks leptin, it makes you hungrier, and it also extinguishes, it stops the extinguishing of reward by that food so that you want more of it. So it does both, because leptin normally suppresses food intake and reduces craving.
The analogy that comes to mind is a slot machine that encourages you to feed more money and hit go to pull the lever, but that also blinds you to the outcome. So even if you win, you don't even know that you have wins. It's also blinding you to your losses. You're effectively becoming an automaton of just eating without any kind of conscious understanding of what you're bringing in or tasting the food any longer.
Exactly.
Right? It's not this like Anna Lemke, when she came on the podcast, author of Dopamine Nation and obviously head of our dual diagnosis addiction clinic at Stanford, talked about, these consumptive behaviors where people are scrolling social media or consuming porn or consuming drugs or alcohol in a way that like they're not in touch with the pleasure of the substance or behavior anymore.
Right.
They become automatons. But if they don't do it, they feel lousy. So the pleasure is gone. The pain is definitely waiting.
Tolerance and dependence. That's the definition of addiction.